The rain had not let up for 3 days. It came in off the fen in gray curtains, soaking the track to the gate until it was less a road than a suggestion of one. And Augusta Fenwick arrived at the embankment works with mud to her knee and her surveying chains rattling against her brother's back. And she was not late. She had checked the clock at the chandlery twice before leaving. But the men assembled at the gate were already watching her from a distance, with the particular stillness of people who had been told to expect someone else. She could see it in the way they stopped talking. She could see it in the way the tallest of them, the one standing slightly apart from the tenant farmers in a coat that had not come cheap, turned to face her and looked her over once, her soaked bonnet, her ink-stained gloves, the chain bag her 12-year-old brother Will was hauling with both hands. And then looked again, as if the first look had failed to produce the result he expected. She had seen that look before. She had been seeing it, in one form or another, for the entirety of her professional life. She walked toward them anyway, because that was what she did, and because the embankment behind them was failing, and because someone had to fix it. "Miss Fenwick." The tall man's voice was not unkind. It was something worse than unkind. It was patient. The voice of a man explaining a simple matter to someone who had wandered into the wrong room. "Sebastian Calloway, Duke of Renfrew. I contracted a Mr. A. Fenwick." "You contracted A. Fenwick," Augusta said. "I am A. Fenwick. The A is for Augusta." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Will, who was 12 and slight and staring up at the Duke, with the frank assessment of a child who has not yet learned to disguise his opinions. Then Sebastian Calloway looked back at Augusta, and the 4 tenant farmers behind him were very quiet. And he said, clearly and without particular malice, in front of all of them, "Your pretty face won't help you here, Miss Fenwick." Augusta did not flinch. She did not flush. She did not smile to soften the room or drop her eyes to suggest she understood his position. She turned to Will, took the chain bag from his hands, removed the lead chain, and passed the bag back to him. Then she stepped past the Duke of Renfrew, into the mud, and walked to the embankment. She crouched at the base of it, pressed 2 fingers into the earth where the seam ran, and felt what she already suspected from the survey notes her father had left. The fill was wrong, the drainage insufficient, and whoever had packed this section 3 years ago had not understood what water does to clay when it has nowhere to go. She set her chain pin, marked the first measurement in her book, and did not look back. Behind her, she heard one of the tenant farmers say something too low to catch. She heard the Duke say nothing. She kept working. It took 40 minutes to complete the first line of measurements. By the time she drove the final pin, the rain had soaked through her coat to her shoulders, and Will had found a stone to sit on and was watching with the serious attention he brought to all her work. When she straightened and turned, Sebastian Calloway was still there. He had not gone back to the house. He had not sent for anyone. He was standing at the edge of the embankment with his hands behind his back, watching her. And when she met his eyes, he said nothing. And she said nothing. And she wrote her second measurement in her book and moved 30 feet along the seam. She worked the full embankment line before the light began to fail. The 4 tenant farmers drifted back to their holdings in 1s and 2s, each of them pausing as they passed her, not to speak, not to interfere, but simply to look, with a quality of attention that was different from the Duke's. They were looking at the chain, at the measurements, at the pins she drove, with the small hammer she carried in her coat pocket. They were looking at someone who knew what they were doing. By the time she packed her instruments and collected Will, the Duke had gone. She walked back to the chandlery in the rain with her brother beside her. and she did not speak. And Will, who had been with her long enough to know when speech was wanted, did not speak either. She boiled water on the small stove in the drafting room above the shop, changed her stockings, and spread her first measurements across the table. She worked by lamplight until well past 9. The numbers told her what she needed to know. They also told her that the existing embankment design was wrong in a way that 3 days of survey would prove beyond any argument. She was not angry. She was not wounded. She was, if anything, very calm. The particular calm that comes when a problem is serious enough to require everything you have. And you know, without any drama, that you have it. The tenant hall that evening smelled of tallow and wet wool. Augusta arrived before the Duke's party and set her materials on the long table at the center of the room. Her father's flood ledger, 20 years of measurements bound in green cloth worn at the spine from use, and her own survey notes from 3 days on the embankment, figures precise to the quarter-inch. She placed them side by side and sat down and waited. Sebastian arrived with his steward and a second man she did not know, shorter, better dressed, with the card case already in his hand. He set the card on the table before he had fully removed his hat. Silas Pemberton, civil engineer, member of the Institution of Civil Engineers. Mr. Pemberton has agreed to resume the contract, Sebastian said, not looking at her. I wanted to inform you personally, Miss Fenwick, rather than by letter. That's considerate, Augusta said. The circumstances of your appointment were irregular. I should have reviewed the contract more carefully before. Has Mr. Pemberton surveyed the embankment? Augusta asked. Sebastian stopped. I am asking whether he has been to the site, Augusta said. Whether he has taken a single measurement, whether he has pressed a finger into the seam at the east section and felt what the fill is doing under pressure. Pemberton cleared his throat. I have reviewed the original construction notes. That is not what I asked, Augusta said. She opened her father's ledger and turned it to face the table. My father surveyed this fen for 20 years. These are his flood measurements, season by season, going back to 1843. Here. She placed her finger on a column. 1851. The water reached this line. Here, 1857. It reached this line. The existing embankment design was drawn, assuming the 1851 level. It was never corrected after 1857. She set her own survey notes beside the ledger. 3 days ago, I took fresh measurements at the seam. The fill has shifted 14 inches since the original construction. If the embankment holds another season under its current design, I would be surprised. If it holds 2, I would be astonished. The room was quiet. Pemberton looked at his card case. Miss Fenwick, Sebastian began. I have one question for you, Your Grace, Augusta said. She did not raise her voice. Mr. Pemberton has shown you his card and his credentials. Has he shown you a single measurement from this fen? One figure, one pin mark, one line in a survey book with his name on it. Sebastian Calloway stood very still. His steward looked at the wall. Pemberton looked at the ledger on the table and then away. The silence stretched for long enough that it became its own kind of answer. The numbers are on the table, Augusta said. They will be there in the morning as well, if you would like more time with them. She did not wait for a response. She closed her ledger, left her survey notes where they lay, and walked out of the hall into the rain. She did not know. Until the steward came to the chandlery the following morning with word that her contract was to be continued, that the Duke had stayed in that hall for another hour after she left. She did not know what he said, or whether he said anything at all. She knew only that the work was hers, and that the embankment was failing, and that she had until the autumn to fix it. The tenant farmers came to her separately, which told her they had not planned it together. The first was a man named Crow, who farmed the low ground nearest the east seam, and whose kitchen had flooded twice in 5 years. He found her at the embankment on the 4th morning and stood at a respectful distance until she looked up from her instrument. "We'd like you to stay on," Crow said. "Whatever the Duke decides. We've watched you work this week, and we'd like you to stay." "The Duke has confirmed the contract," Augusta told him. Crow nodded, but he did not leave. "We'd like you to know it's not only the Duke's decision that keeps you here," he said, "in case that's useful to know." The other 3 came over the following 2 days, each with some variation of the same message, each delivered with the careful dignity of men who were accustomed to having very little power and were offering what they had. Augusta thanked each of them and went back to work. She did not tell any of them that the conversation with Crow had been the first time in 2 years of running her father's practice alone, that anyone had asked her to stay because of what she had done rather than who she had been. She learned later, through Will, who had a gift for being unremarkable in rooms where things were said, that Sebastian had been told by his steward that the tenant farmers were already consulting Augusta directly about the eastern drainage channel. She learned that he had stood in his study for a long time after hearing this and had then said, with no further explanation, "The contract stands." He appeared at the survey site the following morning. He did not explain why. He stood at the edge of the embankment with his hands in his coat pockets and watched her set her chain, and after a while he said, "What are you looking for along this section?" "The point where the fill changes composition," Augusta said. "The original contractor used 2 different sources. You can feel the difference in the density. I'm looking for the exact boundary." "Why does that matter?" "Because the boundary is where it will fail," she said. "Water finds the seam between unlike materials. It always does." He was quiet for a moment. "How do you find the boundary without digging the whole section open?" "Pressure test at intervals," Augusta said. "And the chain measurements. The surface settles differently over the 2 fill types. There's a slight depression here and here." She indicated the points with her hammer. "You can see it if you know what you're looking for." Sebastian Calloway looked at the embankment surface. He looked for a while. "I don't see it," he said. "You will," Augusta said. "By tomorrow you'll see it everywhere." He came back the next morning, and the morning after that. Pemberton did not disappear. He appeared at the estate office on the 3rd day of the joint inspection and spoke with Sebastian privately for the better part of an hour. Will, who had been sent to return a borrowed level to the steward's room and had taken a longer route back than strictly necessary, reported the substance of it to Augusta that evening in the drafting room. "He said the institution doesn't certify women," Will said, with the flat delivery of someone repeating information he finds objectionable. "He said any measurements taken by an uncertified engineer are legally unverifiable. He said if the embankment fails, the liability falls on whoever authorized the uncertified work." "He's not wrong about the certification," Augusta said. She did not look up from her drawing. "He's wrong about everything else," Will said. "He may be wrong about everything else," Augusta said. "That's not the same thing." She did not tell Will what she thought about the rest of it, about the word liability, about the particular efficiency of using the law to accomplish what contempt alone could not quite manage. She kept that for herself and kept drawing. The following day, Sebastian accompanied her to the far embankment, the section that curved out of sight of the main gate and ran along the edge of the lowest-lying tenant ground. The walk took 40 minutes along the ditch bank, and they walked it mostly in silence, which was a different quality of silence than the first days. Less like two people who had nothing to say, and more like two people who had more to say than the situation quite warranted. She was testing the embankment face at the far section, leaning out along the slope to reach the lower course, when her boot found a patch of wet clay that offered no purchase. The slope took her, not far, not fast, but with the absolute certainty of a thing that has decided. And Sebastian's hand closed around her arm before she had fully registered the fall. He hauled her back with a steadiness that suggested he had done something similar before, in some other context, and set her on firm ground, and then he released her arm and stepped back and looked at the fen. "Thank you," Augusta said. "The slope is treacherous in this section," Sebastian said. She turned back to the embankment and found her footing more carefully, and neither of them said anything more about it. The downpour caught them at the far sluice on the 5th day of joint inspection. Not the slow rain that had become ordinary, but a sudden heavy fall that came off the fen with no warning and reduced visibility to 30 feet in under a minute. Augusta's first movement was toward her instruments, to cover the survey book and the level, and Sebastian was already moving when she reached them. He had pulled off his coat and was holding it over the instrument case before she could ask. "The survey data cannot be replaced," he said. "No," Augusta agreed, from under the makeshift shelter of his coat. "It cannot." He held the coat over the instruments for the 10 minutes it took the worst of the rain to pass, standing in his shirt sleeves in the cold without apparent discomfort. And Augusta worked underneath it, adjusting the level and keeping her notes dry. And they did not speak much. And when the rain eased, he retrieved his coat and she packed the instruments, and they walked back along the ditch bank in the ordinary gray drizzle. That evening, Augusta spread her gate drawings across the table in the drafting room above the chandlery. The lamp was small, and the drawings were detailed, and she was deep in the mechanism of the sluice gate design, a modification to the existing structure that she believed would manage the surge pressure more effectively than the current arrangement. When she heard the step on the stair and looked up to find Sebastian standing in the doorway. "I saw the lamp," he said. "I wanted to see the gate drawings." She moved the lamp to the center of the table and let him look. He leaned over the drawings with the attention he had brought to everything she had shown him over the past week. Not the polite attention of a man pretending interest, but the slightly uncomfortable attention of someone discovering that a subject they had dismissed contains more than he had allowed for. "This mechanism here," he said, and reached to trace the sluice arm she had drawn. His hand moved along the page and came to rest, for a moment, beside hers where she was holding the corner of the drawing flat. The pause was brief, a beat, perhaps two, before he straightened and stepped back from the table. "It distributes the surge pressure across the full gate face instead of concentrating it at the central pin," Augusta said, as if nothing had occurred. "The existing design will hold ordinary water levels. It won't hold a significant surge." "And you want to modify the existing gate?" "I want to build the modification before the autumn," Augusta said. "The season is getting short." Sebastian looked at the drawing for another moment. "I'll consider it," he said. He left. Augusta heard his step on the stair, heard the chandlery door, and then there was only the rain on the roof and the lamp and the drawing on the table. She sat down. She looked at the place on the drawing where his hand had rested, which was an absurd thing to look at. And she was aware of that, and she looked at it anyway. Then she put the drawing away, blew out the lamp, and allowed herself exactly 1 furious hour in the dark. Not at him, not at his hand beside hers, not at anything he had done. At herself. At the fact that she had noticed. At the precise cost of noticing, which was not nothing, and which she could not afford, and which she was going to have to manage the same way she managed everything else, by getting up in the morning and going back to the work. She was at the embankment by 7 the following day. She did not think about it again. The storm came 3 weeks before any forecast had predicted. It arrived at night, which was the worst time, and it arrived with the particular force of an autumn system that has spent its patience waiting. The surge came up the Fen Channel faster than Augusta had thought possible when she had worked out the timing in her survey notes. And she was awake and dressed before the chandlery bell had finished ringing because she had been half awake for an hour already, listening to the rain change pitch on the roof. She reached the sluice gate at the same moment Sebastian did. From opposite directions, both of them soaked before they had covered 50 yards. The gate was holding, but the water behind it was already at the level she had marked as critical in her survey. And the embankment to the east, Pemberton's embankment, the section she had not been permitted to touch, was making a sound she did not like. "The modification," Sebastian said. He was looking at her gate design, which she had installed 2 weeks ago against his express refusal, during the 3 days he had been in the county town and his steward had been occupied elsewhere. "You put it in?" "Yes," Augusta said. He looked at the gate. He looked at the water level. He looked at the embankment to the east, which was making the sound again. "What do we do?" he said. "The winch," Augusta said. "The secondary pin needs to be seated before the pressure peaks. If we get it in now, the gate will hold. If we wait 10 minutes, we won't be able to move it." She was already at the winch. The mechanism was stiff with cold and the rain was making the handle slick. And the secondary pin was a heavy iron bar that needed to be driven into its housing against the pressure of the water behind the gate. And it was not a one-person task. Sebastian took the other side of the winch handle without being asked. They worked the winch together in the dark, shouting instructions to each other over the noise of the water. Augusta calling the count, Sebastian matching her pull, both of them leaning into the handle with everything they had. The pin moved in increments. The water climbed the gauge post. The embankment to the east gave a long, grinding report, and then a section of it slid into the channel. Not the full face, not enough to breach, but enough to send a secondary wave against the gate that hit while Augusta's hand was still on the housing pin. The pin seated. The gate held. The wave broke against the face, and the structure absorbed it. And the water on the gauge post began, very slowly, to fall. Augusta became aware of her hand at some point after the immediate crisis had passed. She had driven the pin home with her palm against the housing plate, and the plate had taken a strip of skin from the base of her thumb in payment. She was holding her hand against her coat, and Sebastian was looking at it. "It needs wrapping," he said. "It needs watching," Augusta said, meaning the gate. "I'll wrap it after." She watched the gate for another hour, until the surge had passed its peak and the water was falling steadily and the embankment that remained was holding. Sebastian stayed beside her. He did not speak much. When she finally turned toward the chandlery, he walked beside her as far as the gate of the yard, and then he stopped. "Augusta," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. She waited, but he did not finish whatever he had started to say. He stood in the rain for a moment, and then he turned and walked back toward the estate house. And she went inside and wrapped her hand and sat at the drafting table in the dark and thought about the gate and the pin and the way the water had fallen on the gauge post, and did not think about anything else. He did not come to the survey site the following day, or the day after, or the day after that. On the fourth day, Augusta sent a note to the steward asking whether her storm night measurements were wanted for the official record of the embankment works. The note was not answered. On the 6th day, Will reported that Pemberton had been at the estate house twice in the past week. On the 7th day, Augusta received a letter from the Institution of Civil Engineers acknowledging a petition submitted by Silas Pemberton regarding the Fen works and noting that the matter was under review. She read the letter twice, then set it on the drafting table and went back to her survey notes. Pemberton's petition, as she later learned through the steward, who was, in the end, a man of reasonable conscience, described the storm night as follows. The original embankment design had held against the surge as intended, and an unauthorized modification to the sluice gate by an uncertified contractor had introduced unnecessary risk to the structure. The gate's survival was attributed to the soundness of Pemberton's original embankment work. Augusta's name appeared in the petition as the uncertified contractor, and in one passage as the person styling herself an engineer. She was not surprised. She was not even particularly angry. She was aware of something settling in her, a kind of weight that was less like emotion than like the feeling of a problem clarifying itself, of all the surrounding noise falling away until the essential shape of a thing becomes visible. She prepared her materials for the tenant hall. Sebastian, she learned later, had sat with Pemberton's reinstatement petition for 2 days without signing it. His solicitor had set a deadline. He had let the deadline pass. On the 3rd day, he had gone to his steward and asked to see the survey record Augusta had submitted at the start of the contract. He read it in his study, alone, for the better part of an afternoon. The tenant hall filled on a Tuesday, 3 days after the storm. The farmers came first, Crow and the other 3, their wives behind them, filling the benches along the wall. Then Pemberton arrived with a younger man who carried his documents. Then Sebastian's steward, and then Sebastian himself, who came in last and stood at the back of the room near the door with his arms at his sides. Augusta was already at the table. Will stood behind her with the chain bag, which he held with both hands, and his expression was the expression of a 12-year-old boy who has decided to be very still. Pemberton did not waste time. He stood at the head of the table and addressed the room with the confidence of a man who has prepared his ground carefully. "The matter before us is simple," Pemberton said. An uncertified person was permitted, through an irregularity in the contracting process, to conduct engineering work on this estate. That person, without authorization from the estate's principal or from any recognized body, modified a critical water control structure 3 days before a significant storm event. The modification was installed covertly. It was installed against the expressed wishes of the estate's principal. The Institution of Civil Engineers does not certify women as engineers, and has not done so, and the reasons for this are not arbitrary. They are structural. Unverified work cannot be trusted. Unverified work cannot be insured. And unverified work, when it fails, leaves the estate and its tenants without legal recourse. He paused. "I ask that my original contract be restored. The season is not yet over. The remaining embankment works can still be completed properly by a certified professional." He looked around the room. The tenant farmers looked at the table. "Miss Fenwick," Pemberton said, with a courtesy that was not courtesy, "do you have anything to add?" Augusta opened her father's flood ledger. "I have a few measurements to show," she said. She laid the ledger flat and turned it to the room. "This is my father's survey record for this fen, beginning in 1843. The flood height in 1851 is recorded here. The flood height in 1857, 6 years later, significantly higher, is recorded here." She placed her finger on each entry in turn, slowly enough that the farmers could follow. The embankment design Mr. Pemberton submitted to this estate was drawn to the 1851 level. I found this in the original construction notes during my first survey. I noted it in my written report, which I submitted to the estate steward in the first week of my contract. She set her storm night measurements beside the ledger. 4 nights ago, the surge reached this height. She marked the figure with her pen. This is the line of Mr. Pemberton's embankment, as designed. The surge exceeded it by 11 inches. She drew the second line. This is the section of Mr. Pemberton's embankment that gave way during the storm. It gave way at the point I identified in my survey as the boundary between unlike fill materials, the point where the design was most vulnerable. She let the room look at the 2 lines for a moment. The sluice gate modification I installed is the reason the water that came through that breach did not reach the tenant holdings. I installed it without the estate's permission because I had been refused permission, and the season was running short, and the survey told me the gate as designed would not hold a significant surge. She closed the ledger. I cannot argue with the institution's certification rules, she said. I am not certified. I am aware of that. I am also aware that the measurements on this table are either correct or they are not, and that the gate either held or it did not, and that the east embankment section either failed at the point I identified or it failed somewhere else. She looked at Pemberton. Mr. Pemberton is welcome to check those figures against his own survey data. Pemberton looked at his documents. His own survey data from this fen, Augusta said, if he has any. The room was very quiet. Pemberton turned to the back of the room. Your Grace, he said, this is, in the end, your estate and your decision. The institution's position is clear. The legal exposure is clear. I would ask you to consider what kind of precedent. I was wrong at the gate. Sebastian's voice was not loud, but the room was quiet enough that it did not need to be. He was still standing near the door, and he had not moved. And he spoke in the measured way of someone who has decided carefully what he is going to say. I was wrong at the gate, he said again. 3 weeks ago, I stood at the embankment and told Miss Fenwick, in front of 4 of your neighbors, that her face would not help her here. I said that because I had contracted a man and found a woman, and I was afraid, not of her, but of being wrong about the season, and I turned that fear into an insult. He looked at the farmers along the wall. You have all heard me say things I was certain of. I want you to hear me say this, which I am also certain of. I was wrong in my judgment of her work, and I was wrong about the rule I have held since my father's time. And the storm 3 nights ago made the cost of that error very plain to me. He looked at Pemberton. Your contract is rescinded, Mr. Pemberton. I am sorry for the inconvenience. Pemberton's face underwent several changes in rapid succession. Your Grace, the institution may write to my solicitor, Sebastian said. He will respond in the customary way. He looked at Augusta. The room looked at Augusta. Will behind her had gone very still. Miss Fenwick, Sebastian said, I am asking you, before everyone present, to take the remaining works under your own name. The contract will be reissued. The terms will be whatever you require. Augusta looked at him for a moment. She looked at the measurements on the table, and the ledger, and the chain bag in her brother's hands. I will need to review the terms, she said. Of course, Sebastian said. She nodded once, gathered her papers, and said nothing further in the hall. The farmers filed out slowly, and the steward collected Pemberton's documents from the table with the careful neutrality of a man performing a task he finds quietly satisfying. And Will carried the chain bags out into the yard. And then the hall was empty, except for Augusta and Sebastian. She had not left. She had not planned to stay. But she had found herself standing at the table after the last farmer had gone, her father's ledger under her arm. And she waited until the door had closed behind the steward before she spoke. "I will take the contract," she said. Sebastian said, "I'm glad." "I need you to understand something," Augusta said. "The contract is one thing. It is a business arrangement between an engineer and an estate, and I will execute it as I would any other contract. And I will be paid the agreed rate. And when the work is finished, we will both have what we came here for." She looked at him directly. "Whatever else you are asking, and I think you are asking something else, that is a separate matter, and you will need to earn it separately, not by one afternoon's public honesty, however much that cost you." Sebastian was quiet for a moment. "That's fair," he said. "It's not about fairness," Augusta said. "It's about what I can afford to trust, and what I cannot, and how much evidence I require before I change the category something belongs in." She picked up her father's ledger. "Good evening, Your Grace." She walked out of the hall and across the yard to the chandlery, and she did not look back, and she was not angry, and she was not hopeful, and she was not certain of anything except that the embankment still needed finishing, and that she was the one who was going to finish it. She was at the restored gate the following morning before 7, checking the pin housing she had driven home in the dark during the storm, running her fingers along the housing plate to feel for any deformation in the metal. The fen was gray and still in the early light, the water low after the surge had passed, and the air smelled of wet earth and the particular cold that comes before the season turns. She heard him on the ditch bank behind her and did not turn. Sebastian came to stand beside her at the gate. He looked at the housing plate and at the water level on the gauge post, and then he said, "I want to tell you something about the rule." Augusta waited. "My father had a rule about authority," Sebastian said. He believed that testimony without institutional standing was not reliable, that a person's word, however sincerely offered, was not the same as verified expertise. He cited it often. He applied it consistently. He paused. "When I was 9 years old, a woman who lived on the South Fen came to the house and told my father that the drainage channel at the bottom of the low field was going to break. She had been watching it for 2 seasons. She described exactly where it would fail and why. My father thanked her and sent her home." He stopped. Augusta turned to look at him. "My brother Edmund was 11, Sebastian said. "He was in the low field the morning the channel broke. By the time anyone reached him, the water had already—" He stopped again. The muscle in his jaw moved. "My father spent the rest of his life calling it a tragedy of nature. He never once said that a woman had told him exactly where it would happen, and he had not listened. He turned his grief into a principle, and the principle was, unverified testimony cannot be trusted. And I inherited that principle without examining it. For 30 years. He looked at the gate. "I did not understand until I was standing in that hall yesterday," he said, "that the rule I have been keeping was not a principle at all. It was a way of not thinking about Edmund." Augusta looked at him for a long moment, at the steadiness with which he held himself, the absence of any performance in it, the quality of a man saying a thing he has never said before, and finding that it does not destroy him. She kissed him. Once, deliberate, unhurried, her hand briefly against his arm, her face close to his in the cold morning air. Then she stepped back. She did not say anything. There was nothing she needed to say that the kiss had not already said. And she had learned, over a long professional life, of being expected to explain herself. that there was a particular power in choosing not to. She turned back to the gate housing and continued her inspection. Sebastian stood beside her while she worked, and after a while he asked a question about the housing plate, and she answered it, and the morning continued. 1 year later, the fen was different. The new sluice gate stood at the junction of the main channel and the east drainage cut, its housing seated in dressed stone, its mechanism drawing smoothly under any water level Augusta had tested it to. The embankment ran clean along its full length, the fill consistent, the seam between sections packed to a specification she had written herself. The low tenant ground was dry in autumn for the first time in a decade, and Crow had planted the field below his kitchen garden for the first time since he had taken the holding. The autumn storm came in off the fen on an October night, steady and heavy and not surprised by, and the gate held. The water climbed the gauge post to the level Augusta had marked as the design maximum and stayed there and fell, and the embankment did not speak. A lamp burned in the drafting room above the chandlery late into that evening. On the table beneath it, 2 sets of instruments lay packed side by side. Augusta's survey kit in its worn leather case, the level she had carried since her father's time, the chain that Will had once hauled in the rain, and beside it, a newer case, the instruments of a man who had begun learning in the past year that measurement and testimony are not opposites, and that the gap between what you know and what you are willing to trust is sometimes nothing more than the distance between an old grief and the present moment. The lamp burned until late. The gate held. The fen was still.